place far, far away, I started college. Yes, it was long, long ago. And like any good, successful high school debater, I figured that my career was going to be in law or politics. So the first degree, my first course of study, was political science. And I remember the very first class I took at the University of California, Poli-Sci 101. And to this day, I cannot forget one of the key teachings that were taught on that first day. The professor told us that in order to control society, in order to have political power, you needed to be able to control at least two of three elements: people, money, or information. And through the rest of the 10-week course, he showed us, demonstrating this through leaders throughout all of history, that when someone was able to control the people in society through influencing them in the direction they went, control the money or the valuable resources in society, or were able to control the information and the sources of information, if they had two of those three, they would have political power and control over the society. And it was true century after century. In fact, it was as true in Jesus' time as it is today. So, being the political science student, I found myself reflecting on today's gospel to try to understand what was the political climate in the terms of this gospel story. So think about what was going on as Jesus and his friends were walking to Capernaum. They were living in a society of an occupied nation. The Jewish people were, their country and their land was occupied by their Roman rulers. And every right, every privilege they had in their society was only there because it was granted by the dominant authority. We know that the Herodians were in power as almost like a puppet government of the Romans. And they tried to act as a buffer, trying to get the people to cooperate with the Romans in return for a few benefits and values that they would be able to have as a society. But like any society, we also know that people don't like to be repressed. And so during a period of repression by a stronger power, they try to gain more power. They try to struggle for more power and even revolt. And we know at the time of Jesus, there were the Zealots, the group that was trying to overthrow the Roman rulers. So this is the context in which Jesus now is beginning to rise as a religious leader in his society. And this had to be pretty heady stuff for the apostles. They are an oppressed people that have been pushed down, and now they've connected themselves. They're riding the coattails of this rising religious leader. And now they have the opportunity to perhaps themselves gain even more influence in their society. So you can almost hear the conversation as they're walking to Capernaum that day, just out of earshot of Jesus. You have them talking amongst themselves. Who's going to have what role in Jesus' cabinet? Hey, John, we know you're his favorite. You probably got VP locked up. And Peter, you were really good at the fishing industry. Perhaps you could be Secretary of Commerce. You know, Matthew, we really don't like tax collectors. You can go sit in the corner and run the IRS. We're going to trust the Secretary of Treasury to someone far more trustworthy. Judas, you up for that? Okay, maybe that's not exactly how the conversation went, but we do know from the gospel that they were arguing among themselves on who was the greatest, who would have the most power among them. And so when they get to Capernaum, Jesus knows what they've been talking about, so he slyly, as he always does, asks them, "So guys, what were you talking about on the way?" But they know they're heading in the wrong direction here. They're on dangerous grounds, so they're quiet. But he knows. So then he begins to teach them, and he tells them the exact opposite of what they expect to hear. To be the greatest of all, they're like, yes, here's the magic ticket. He's going to tell us. He says you need to be the last of all and the least of all. And then to illustrate his point, he finds a small child, some dirty little ragamuffin, and he calls him to him, and he puts his arms around him. And he says, whoever receives a child such as this in my name receives me and the one who sent me. Minds explode. They're not ready for this sort of teaching. That's the exact opposite of how you gain power. What does this little ragamuffin and receiving him have anything to do with receiving power, which is really their motivation at this moment? You see, kids have never been powerful in society, right? Children are smaller, they're weaker than the adults in their society. They have to be reliant on their parents or other guardians for most of what they get in life. And kids, I hate to break it to you, you have practically no legal rights. But despite what I've just described, you are living in the golden age of children. You know, back when my father was a child, he used to tell me that he lived at a time when children were seen but not heard. That's right, parents, the golden age. In fact, he and his brother and sister were not allowed to speak at the dinner table because children had nothing of value to add to adult conversation. But even in my father's time, that was far superior to the first century in Judea. If you were a child up until the time you became an adult, you were sort of a necessary burden. You know, until you were grown, you couldn't help till the fields. You couldn't help defend the family if it was under attack. You were more a piece of property that was owned by the father. But our Jewish brothers and sisters are actually far more advanced in kind than their Roman conquerors. Did you know that in Roman society, that if there was an unwanted child, it was acceptable just to leave them on the side of the road to die? So children have never been the emblem of power. They have been the emblem of the exact opposite, of weakness. And so for Jesus to tell his apostles that to receive one of these completely powerless, considered worthless creatures, and when they did that, it would be as if receiving him, that was the exact opposite of what they could understand. But we know, of course, that the wisdom of Jesus' teaching is profound. Now, when we hear the reading, we put ourselves in the position of the disciples, and we know as a disciple, we hear Jesus saying, guys, if you want to follow me, you need to be the last of all and servant of all. And we hear that message, and it's important that we do. But I think we fail to understand a second very important message in this reading. We in this reading do not only stand in the position of the disciples, we stand in the position of that small child, the one that is weak and has no power. For when Jesus puts his arms around that child, that is also a symbol of the way that God receives us. That compared to God, we are weak, we are small. But God receives us anyway. God embraces us anyway. God is not in relationship with us because we chose the relationship, but because God chose the relationship. God does not reach out to us because of something we can do for God. We are weak and God is powerful. We are not in relationship with God because we are worthy. It's because God is worthy. God reaches out to us in our brokenness, in our weakness, in our foolishness, in our corrupt lives, and still puts his arms around us and welcomes us to him. He died for us, not because we are worthy, but because he was worthy. So when we look at today's gospel reading, we need to accept also the joy of this gospel message. Gospels will always challenge us, and we are challenged to serve the least. But the consolation of this gospel message is that what we are asked to do, that God has already done for us. We are the little children. But like most little children, as we grow, we really do want to grab on a little more power. And it's very common of all of us as we grow. We say, and teenagers, I'm speaking mostly to you right now, you know that it's like, I'm not the little kid anymore, right? I should have a little more self-determination and a little self-control. Well, guess what? All of your parents have been in the exact same place. Don't let them tell you otherwise. And then we become young adults, and what do when we enter the business world? We try to collect those sources of power that my poli-sci teacher talked about so many years ago. We go to work and we try to get higher levels of responsibility so we have more control on our organization. Perhaps we can manage more people. We start to save money so that we can be secure from the money that we've saved. And we tell the story of our lives in the way that we chose to tell that story. Never before have we had such great control of the information around us. Social media being an amazing tool for letting people know how wonderful you are. Did you ever notice that, no one goes out and posts all of their flaws on Facebook or on Instagram or Snapchat? No, it's all the great things in our life, the things we do well. We are doing exactly the same thing, and my poli-sci teacher told us that leaders do. And that's how we live the first part of our adult life. But fortunately for most of us, we get around the mid part of our adult life and we have a revelation. And we realize that no matter how much power we have in our workplace, no matter how much money we save and earn and collect, no matter how well we spin the story of our lives, it's never going to be enough. And it's in that realization that we can understand that only when we accept the fact that we are the small, weak child of God, that we can live the destiny that God calls us to. Only then do we begin to serve the last and the least. Now, I'd like to try to tell you that my life was better than anyone else's, but it wasn't. I spent the entire first half of my adult life doing exactly all of this. Remember, I was going to be a politician or I was going to be a lawyer. So I thought I was going to be a political or corporate head. And I climbed that ladder aggressively in the first half of my adult life. And it was only through the blessing of the downturns and the bubbles bursting in the early 2000s, when suddenly that ladder that I was climbing became unstable, that God forced me onto a different path. And finally led me to the moment where I was working in a position where it was my job to serve the last and the least. 1,000 men and women that spent time away from home for months at a time. And I remember that when I was working on the cruise ships, that guests would come to me because they'd hear the title and they'd see the uniform, and they thought they were talking to someone with position and privilege. And they would say, "So how is it to be a senior officer on such a beautiful ship?" And I thank God that God had given me the understanding and the words to respond. And I told them it was my honor and privilege to serve those people that served them. You see, God had not only made me a servant, God had made me the servant of the servants. And that's what every one of us as a Christian disciple is called to do. In today's gospel reading, we are called to understand that we are weak in the shadow of God's mighty strength. And we are called, once we can accept God's love in our weakness, to share our love with the weakest among us. For me, well, I have the good fortune to get a constant reminder, because deacon, which means servant, is the one title that God has asked me to wear.